morning, everybody. On behalf of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, I'd like to welcome you to today's briefing, Bold Housing Solutions, Opportunities to Expand the National Housing Trust Fund. I'm Sarah Michelson. I'm the Senior Policy Director at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and our mission, for those of you who are unaware, is to ensure that people with the very lowest incomes have access to safe, decent, and affordable housing. In part, our mission is to focus on people with the greatest needs because we know that that's what the data tells us where the greatest needs are. The lowest income seniors, people with disabilities, families with young children, those are the folks who are facing the greatest challenges when it comes to the affordable housing crisis. Just a recap of some of our earlier reports, we put out an annual gap report that looks at the shortage of housing across the country. We found that there's a shortage of more than 7.1 million homes for our nation's 11.4 million extremely low-income households. This means that there are just 35 homes for every 100 families that earn that income. And without affordable housing options, 3 out of 4 spend more than half of their income on rent, leaving behind very few resources to take care of other basic needs, like putting food on the table, paying for medications, saving for a rainy day. At the same time, our federal investments in housing haven't kept pace with the growing need, and today 3 in 4 families eligible for housing assistance are turned away and don't receive any help. This is an issue that impacts every state, every congressional district, every community, whether urban, rural, or suburban. The same trend is true, that people with the very lowest incomes are facing the greatest shortage and the greatest impact of the affordable housing crisis. Because of this data, NLHC, our congressional champions, state and local organizations all advocated for creating the National Housing Trust Fund precisely to meet this need. And today we have about 2,000 organizations that have signed on to endorse our campaign to significantly expand the Housing Trust Fund going forward. During this briefing, we'll hear from our experts on the panel about how the initial National Housing Trust Fund dollars have been used and how it's impacted local communities and why Congress should significantly expand this resource. My colleague, Ed Gramlich, who's Senior Advisor of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, will discuss the findings from our latest report, Getting Started. Jennifer Holler, Director of Policy and Special Projects from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, as well as Mary Tingerfall, Commissioner from the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, will share how they have used the Housing Trust Fund dollars to serve the lowest income residents of their states. And Shonda Sorrells, who will be with us shortly, Chief Operating Officer of the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, Maryland, will discuss what a significant expansion of the Housing Trust Fund would mean for tackling the affordable housing crisis. Next year, Congress will have several legislative opportunities to expand the Housing Trust Fund, including legislation impacting housing finance reform, infrastructure proposals, and new bills like Senator Warren's American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. We know what solutions are needed. We just need to build the political will to do what's right and fund these solutions at the level that's necessary. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers today, starting with Ed.
Thank you, Sarah. As the slide says and as the interim report says, it's about getting started. So let's get started. I'm going to spend about 3 minutes explaining the National Housing Trust Fund for those of you who are not familiar with it. The primary purpose of the National Housing Trust Fund is to increase and preserve the supply of housing that's affordable to extremely low-income people. I'm always bad about reminding myself to change the slide, so staff, give me a kick. So extremely low-income households are those with incomes at or below 30% of the area median income or less than the federal poverty line. The statute, to that extent, the statute requires that 90%, at least 90% of a state's trust fund allocation be used to build, rehabilitate, preserve, or operate rental housing. The emphasis is on rental housing. The statute allows states to spend up to 10% of their trust fund allocation for homeowner activities, but to date, none have chosen that approach just yet. When there's less than $1 billion in the National Housing Trust Fund, the regulations require that 100% of a state's allocation be used to benefit extremely low-income households. The trust fund became law on July 30th, 2008, as part of the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of that year. The statute created an initial dedicated source of funding for the National Housing Trust Fund. By dedicated money, we're talking about money that's not subject to the appropriations process. And the initial dedicated source is a 0.042% assessment on the volume of new business by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. 65% of the money goes into the National Housing Trust Fund. 35% goes into something called the Capital Magnet Fund, which we don't have time to talk about today. Now that was in July of 2008. Fall rolls around in 2008 and we got the banking crisis. So consequently, that assessment was put on hold. But now, we fast forward to December 14th, 2014. Fannie and Freddie have been stable for a couple of years. Therefore, that hold on the assessment was removed. And beginning on January 1st of 2015, Fannie and Freddie start putting aside that assessment. And throughout the calendar year of 2015, they're gathering this money. And at the end of 2015, the beginning of 2016, we have $174 million in the National Housing Trust Fund for 2016. Currently in 2018, we have $267 million in the trust fund. The trust fund is kind of different from other federal programs in some ways because it's a block grant to the states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the territories. The statute requires states to designate an entity to operate and administer their National Housing Trust Fund allocation, and Mary and Jen are representatives from Minnesota and Vermont who are the people who are actually doing this work. The statute also requires a state to annually prepare a trust fund allocation plan, and the law requires that allocation plan to describe the criteria for selecting applications for that money. And the law requires that criteria to give priority to 6 factors. And I'm going to emphasize 3 factors here. It must give priority based on the extent to which rents are affordable to extremely low-income households, the length of time these assisted units will remain affordable, and the merit of the project. So that is a very brief overview of the rudiments of the National Housing Trust Fund. Excuse me. Some slides didn't get edited out. Okay, sorry about that. I edited those out at the time, so please bear with me. So this is an overview of the findings that are in the interim report. I've been collecting information from states that have awarded their 2016 trust fund allocations. So I've got project-specific information. Out of those 42 states, 4 states have not awarded all of their money just yet, but they are confident that they'll be able to do that before the end of this calendar year. And while the slide says that there are 9 states that are having to make their 2016 awards by the end of this year, I really should change that because it's really now 7 states, because Oregon and Michigan have actually made their awards, but we don't have any information about the projects or the number of units in them. So that will be in an update that I'll be preparing at the end of, well, the beginning of 2019. Now, out of those 42 states, 129, more than 129 projects have actually been awarded that we have information about. The state of South Carolina also has made their awards, but we don't have their information yet either. But that 42, then if you take away, when we go down to the number of trust fund units that we actually know about, I'm reporting on 41 states. The state of Maryland has made their project awards, but they haven't decided how many units in those projects will be trust fund assisted. So at the end of the year, there'll be far more than 1,468 trust fund assisted units. Now you remember I talked about the merits of the project. The states seem to have really taken that notion to heart because most of them have targeted their trust fund assisted units to special needs populations. So for example, there are at least 433 units that will benefit homeless people and homeless individuals and families. In addition to those 198 units, out of those 433, 198 units are in projects where there's no specific subcategory that's been targeted. So there are, in your report, you will see that there are at least 6 other kind of subgroups, such as chronic homelessness. States are targeting their trust fund money to people with disabilities. There are at least 347 trust fund assisted units. 114 of those are in projects where they don't have specific subgroups, but there are 9 variations of subgroups that are in the report, such as people with developmental disabilities. Elderly populations are also targeted. We have over 244 units that are targeted to elderly people. 145 of those don't have any specific subgroup, but there, in addition to those, there are 5 subgroups that are reported in the report. 88 trust fund assisted units are going to be benefiting veterans, and there are a number of subgroups of veterans that are entailed as well. And there's 4 examples that I thought kind of unique. There's at least one project that's going to be devoted to domestic violence survivors. There's one project for at-risk women with children. There are 7 projects that are going to be housing people re-entering the community from incarceration. And there's another project that is aiming to prevent people from becoming incarcerated. So those are kind of unique target areas. There are 2 projects in South Dakota and 1 in North Dakota that are targeted to Native Americans. And then finally, there are 36 projects that are not targeted at all, but still, trust fund assisted units have to be occupied by people who are income eligible. That is, that they're extremely low-income people. There are various kinds of activities that can be carried out with trust fund dollars. 71 of the projects are construction only, but in addition to that construction only, there are 4 subcategories, kind of mixes and matches of other ways in which construction is involved with their other activities going on, and that's explained also in the report. Rehabilitation is an obvious use of the money. There are 13 projects that are rehabilitation only, but then there are other kind of subgroups, and let me touch upon 3 of those. There are 2 historic rehab projects. There are 2 adaptive reuse projects. A warehouse and a former junior high are going to be converted into affordable housing for extremely low-income people. Another kind of interesting use of the money is in one place they're converting a vacant commercial property into 20 SROs. And then there are 24 projects that are preservation of existing affordable housing. And then finally, I want to stress that the trust fund is an important financing gap that a lot of projects rely upon. So there are 85 projects that rely on the local housing tax credit. The trust fund helps close the gap. Interestingly enough, there are 35 projects that do not use trust fund money at all. The home program is an essential component in 49 projects. Affordable housing program of the Federal Home Loan Banks is in 21 projects. State and local housing trust funds, which are the inspiration for the National Housing Trust Fund, are in 26 projects. And then various other kinds of state programs are in 51 projects. So that's kind of a very quick overview of what's in the report. There's much more information on our website, and I hope to be able to answer questions later on if the other speakers are done. Thank you.
Our next next speaker will be Mary Kinderthal.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here this morning. My name is Mary Tinkerfall, and I serve as the Commissioner of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency in Minnesota. This is our state housing finance agency, and for those of you who know something about your housing finance agencies, some of them just do financing, and there's another housing agency somewhere in the state. In Minnesota, we're all kind of rolled into one, and so we administer not only the sale of bonds and financing home ownership, but we also administer home, the National Housing Trust Fund, and also allocate low-income housing tax credits. So we do get the opportunity to really bring all resources together, whether they be state, federal, and local, to try to finance on average about 25 to 30 new projects every year throughout the state of Minnesota. And that can range from, and those are all rental projects, and that can range from the kind of projects I'll be talking with you about today that are targeted to very low income families, to housing for seniors, to workforce housing located throughout the state. I left this first slide up because this is an issue of just-in-time events for this particular event today. This picture was taken literally last Thursday in the small town of St. Peter, Minnesota. That's about an hour and a half to the southwest of the Twin Cities, and very strong community. And one of the anchor institutions of the community is the state incarceration hospital for people with mental illness. And that is a very important storyline to why the project that we've done as our first National Housing Trust Fund project is located there. In this picture, you see it really does take a village to do 30 units of housing. And in this picture, you have the mayor, you have county commissioners, you have the city administrator, you have to the left of the scissors in the gray and white jacket, you have the judge who runs the drug recovery court for the St. Peter Hospital, and many, many other folks in the neighborhood, schools, etc., that will really be necessary in order to make this project work. So our mission at Minnesota Housing is that we really believe that housing is a foundation for success. And all of the housing we do, we approach in that manner. Whether it's home ownership, we really want people not to just get a mortgage, but to have a sustainable mortgage that they can keep over the long term. But also for our rental housing. And that gets particularly tough for people who are very low income and maybe fighting multiple barriers. So over the last 8 years since I've been there, and certainly before that, we really reach across the aisle to our other agencies. We work very closely with our Department of Human Services, our Education Department, our Health Department, our Corrections Department, to really make sure that we're creating housing for those who need it the most. Early this year, the current governor, Governor Dayton, who is in his last term of 8 years, determined that it would be a good idea, with all of the media attention to the issues of housing, that we convene a housing task force. And over a period of about 8 months, 28 individuals, bipartisan, all walks of life, got together and took a look at our situation in housing in Minnesota. And one of the most stark numbers that came out of that research is that while we are about 50,000 units short of housing just in general, across all income categories, you know, our population's been growing faster than our housing stock. If you isolate that and you look at it by income group, we're actually 113,000 units short for extremely low income households. So what that means is that there are units that are occupied by people who make more money that would that could be affordable to those lower income households, but they're not occupied by those households. More than 3/4 of extremely low income households in Minnesota are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And I'm sure that's similar in many of your states. And rents would have to be $600 per month or less to be affordable to extremely low income households. And just as a point of reference, in the Twin Cities right now, if you're doing just a straight up low income housing tax credit development with no subsidy other than the tax credits, you're probably looking at rents at 60% of median at about $1,200 a month. So literally half. So we have to be very creative in how we use the housing task force, the housing trust fund money, and combine it with other resources as well. One of the things we like about the National Housing Trust Fund is it allows us to meet two of our key strategic priorities. One is to prevent and end homelessness. We have seen a drop in overall homelessness over the last 6 years since we've had a plan in place. However, we have seen, as many other places have seen, an increase in unsheltered homelessness. We have been very, very focused on a group that you'll see in this project is a focus, and that is households with children who have experienced homelessness. The project I referred to earlier is the Solace Apartments project. It utilized our entire 2016 National Housing Trust Fund allocation of $2.7 million, 30 units, supportive housing development in rural Minnesota. And no, that is not photoshopped. Actually, the building is very close to the water tower. So what does that project look like? It is 30 units of supportive housing. 16 are funded using National Housing Trust Fund, and 8 are funded using the HOME program. We do like the fact that you can combine HOME and National Housing Trust Fund. We actually have some ideas about how that combination could be made a little smoother with some administrative changes. It is a housing first model, which means that people do not have to have committed to sobriety when they move into this project. And it is serving women exiting incarceration and with a focus on family reintegration. So most of the women who will live in this project will not have been living with their children, oftentimes for several years. So one of the great benefits of this project is it allows those mothers to be reunited with their children at this location. There was a 3-year planning process for this project, and when I was at the ribbon cutting, the list of people who were involved in that planning process went for several pages. It included the drug courts, the judge I talked about earlier. County services were critically important because in Minnesota, human services are administered by counties at a county level. A nonprofit development company called the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, and private service organizations that are delivering the services on site. The capital structure for this, some of you might be surprised, but we actually did this with private activity bonds. Any of you who work on tax issues at all may recall we had a tax reform bill about a year ago right now where we almost lost private activity bonds, and Solace was one of those projects that we were scurrying to figure out how we might still do the project if in fact we had lost the ability to issue private activity bonds and utilize those 4% tax credits, which add a couple $1 million to a project like this. NeighborWorks also provided some funds because the developer is a NeighborWorks organization, and city, county, and philanthropic resources. I hope to have a little video to show you, but we had some technical difficulties this morning, so we have to settle for a quote. Amanda Felix, who I met on Thursday, wonderful woman with 2 young boys, who she is about to be reunited with, said, "This place, this building, these people, this community, this is where I'm going to make my home." And she is definitely on the road to recovery and on the way to employment. and perhaps most important, uniting with their kids. I'm going to wrap up by talking about what's next. Our 2017 allocation was allocated to a project in Minneapolis called Park 7. This project is literally almost within the shadows of US Bank Stadium. So anybody who might have watched the Vikings last night saw the team that plays there. And it will involve the new construction of 61 rental units, including 31 units for people who have experienced long-term homelessness and 10 units for people with disabilities. We have a source of rental assistance in Minnesota that's available for people who have experienced severe mental illness. We also do use the Section 811 program occasionally, not in this project, but that's another important resource from the federal government that we count on for helping people with disabilities. And it is located in an area that is rapidly gentrifying. I swear every time I go to downtown Minneapolis, there is yet another many-story apartment building that's filling a vacant lot in this neighborhood that's sat with vacant lots for many years. So the benefit for people living there, it's very close to jobs and transit and services, very close to the county hospital that provides a lot of services for people who've experienced homelessness. Next up, and this will be formalized on Thursday of this week when my board meets, but we have selected 2 projects to receive National Housing Trust Fund money. Dublin Heights in Mankato. This will be actually a pretty straight up low-income housing tax credit development, 45 units, but 14 of those units will be supportive housing units for people who meet the requirements of the National Housing Trust Fund. This is a model we use pretty frequently in Minnesota. We don't just do congregate housing for people with disabilities or who have experienced homeless. We do some of that because some people prefer that kind of setting. But we also do units that are located within more conventional projects. We will also be doing a similar project up in the center of the state in Baxter, Minnesota, home of Paul Bunyan. And it's a 40-unit mixed income new construction project with 20 supportive housing units. And this will just, can't really see that very well, but you can see Minneapolis is over on the right, the 2 to the south and the 1 in the center of the state. So the final thoughts that I want to leave you with, and we'll be working with the Low Income Housing Coalition and HUD to talk about some of these, but final rulemaking is in process for the National Housing Trust Fund, and we're hoping to converse about the need to clarify and confirm some expanded uses for operating support within the rules, and also make sure that there aren't unintentional places where this program doesn't align quite perfectly with other federal resources. They're not huge tweaks. I don't want to give the impression that we're saying the program's broken. We're just saying after we have a little experience with it, there are a couple of things that could be tweaked to make it work even better. And finally, I just want to leave you with the thought that as your bosses consider housing finance reform, that remembering that the Housing Trust Fund is a critical part of that agenda is something that I hope you will take away with you today. And with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Good morning. My name is Jen Holler. I am with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. VHCB is a quasi-public instrumentality that serves the entire state. And we were set up 30 years ago to administer the funding from a state trust fund for the purposes, the dual purposes of affordable housing and land conservation. So we
administer those state funds. We provide funding to local developers and others. We also administer the home and the housing trust fund program. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. Our experience and what we, the way we decided to use the housing trust fund is a little bit different. So we thought maybe our two states would kind of provide a good illustration of both. But I'd like to start by just mentioning that in advance of the election, our public radio and public television station did a survey of Vermonters, a statewide poll, and after asking the usual questions about the various candidates, they asked a few background questions just to get a sense of what's on people's minds. So they asked, if you consider your regular living expenses, which single expense creates the most financial stress in your life? And people's responses were things like 4% said transportation, 15% said healthcare costs, 18% said taxes, and 32% said housing. Housing is by far the biggest financial stressor on Vermonters' lives, and I'm guessing that's true in many of your states as well. So just a little bit more background. I mentioned that VHCD's been around for 30 years, and this is the context in which we have welcomed, been really excited about the Housing Trust Fund. We know it took decades really of work to make it come together, not only to get it authorized, but then to get it funded. We're incredibly grateful for that. It works well with the other federal programs that we use. We receive the small state minimum, which is really important. So $3 million comes to Vermont every year from the Housing Trust Fund. We prepared an allocation plan and referenced that. That goes out for public comment. It basically says to HUD, this is how we're going to use the money and how we're going to allocate it to projects. We award the funding competitively. People apply to us. We have a housing staff that essentially underwrites the projects, make sure they're going to meet all the requirements, but then also making sure they're going to meet the highest priority needs in the communities that they propose to serve. And we always look at housing needs in that particular area to make sure that they're well aligned. And then those funding recommendations get made to our board, which is an 11-member publicly appointed board, and they make the actual final funding decisions. So one of the great things about the Housing Trust Fund is that there's flexibility in how you can use it. And so Vermont's looked at the various options, and decided the highest need for this particular funding source, and the different housing programs tend to get blended together. The most important need for the Housing Trust Fund is for multifamily development, the creation and building of new apartments, or the rehab of substandard units that are offline and not in full use, or not just good places to live. So that's how we've decided to use it. And the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, in any project we fund, we layer on this additional requirement that the units be affordable in perpetuity. So there's a housing subsidy covenant that gets layered on to every project that requires those units to essentially to stay affordable over time. And the preferences we created in the allocation plan for Vermont, again, was an emphasis on permanent supportive housing. So housing where people could stay as long as they wanted, so not transitional housing. People could stay as long as they wanted, that was very affordable to people at 30%, and that has the services they need in order, they need it at sometimes and maybe not need at others in order to be able to be stably housed. We always emphasize projects that are in infill areas, places where people have access to services, where transportation costs aren't going to be high, and to meet sort of our land use goals in Vermont. And then emphasis, as I said, on the creation of new units or the preservation of privately owned subsidized units that are at risk of becoming not affordable. So that was the approach we decided to take. And so what I'd like to do is show you a few examples of the projects that we funded in a minute, and then also sort of close with a few parting thoughts. So the first year of funding, FY16, has been completely committed. Some of the projects are done and people are actually moving in. So we supported 7 different developments, 182 homes, and 17 of those are specifically designated as Housing Trust Fund units. So I think it's important to think about the impact is much greater than 17 units because without that funding, those 182 wouldn't have been possible. So sometimes there's this official like label that goes with certain units and it has to do with compliance and how you have to track things and report things. But essentially, the Housing Trust Fund money is making the overall projects possible. So I want to make that point. FY17 is fully committed to another 5 or 6 projects, and we're well on the way of committing the FY18 money, and more applications are coming in the door, so those will be dedicated to specific projects soon. So here's one of the first projects that we reviewed and funded the Housing Trust Fund, and I think it provides a good example for the kind of things that the Housing Trust Fund can make possible and what it's really intended for. So this was a former roadside motel in Brattleboro. It was pretty blighted, pretty troubled, a concern to the community, and the local housing nonprofit, Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust, pulled together a partnership in order to buy it, reorient it, and then you can see the artist rendering on the bottom, and we reorient the site so that it centered around the community building, added lots of green space, and there are now 22 new micro apartments, and they're all affordable at 30% of median. They serve the homeless and those who are at risk of homelessness, and there are support services on site. People have moved in, and this is what it looks like now. It hadn't been part of the plan, but you can think back to that sketch. It's kind of a U shape, but in the center of it is this enormous tree. And what's happened is that the residents have, and this wasn't part of the plan, but they tend to gather outside that, and it's become kind of a focal point for their community. So that's been kind of exciting. This is one of the new residents. There's Melvin up there in the corner. We actually have the incomes of the folks that live here. I'm going to check my notes here for a minute so I can be sure to get this right. But just to give you an example of the kind of people that the Housing Trust Fund is allowing us to serve, so there are 22 households. They're in these micro apartments that come with built-in furnishings because these folks are coming with nothing. They also get a welcome package of kind of basic household supplies. There are actually 2 children that live here with their parents. And the incomes of the folks who live here range from $25,000 to 0. The average is $14,000. And if you look at the combined income of every household who lives in these 22 homes, it's $154,000, which is pretty incredible to think about, I think. One of the reasons I'm spending a little more time on this particular development is because I think it might serve as a model for some rural states. I mean, there are these motels along our byways and highways that are sort of falling into disrepair. The travel industry, people's preferences have really evolved. And maybe it's something that other communities can look to. These are sources that are available in other places, and there are the same kind of partnerships that could be created to do that. Brattleboro is a town of 11,600 people. This is our biggest community in Vermont, the city of Burlington, and this is actually an artist rendering of what will happen. It's underway, but not complete. It's on the shore of Lake Champlain, and it's known as Cambrian Rise, which is apparently named after some kind of geological ancient period of time. So it's a little funky, but that's what it is. Cambrian Rise. And this is eventually going to be, it's a public-private partnership. It's eventually going to be a total, when the build-out's done over the course of 5 or 6 years, 770 homes, which for Vermont is huge. And the really great thing about this is the public-private partnership that's happening is making sure that there are going to be, at least a third of these are going to be affordable. And so when it all comes together, there will be a mixed income, mixed generation community that allows people, even those who are homeless, to be part of this community and have access to the lake. And there's 12 acres of a conserved park. That's part of our dual mission. So we help fund the conserved park that's along the water. So people of all means are going to be able to live together and have access to a really beautiful part of Vermont that otherwise would have been saved to people who had a lot more resources. And that right now there are 76 apartments being built with Housing Trust Fund dollars by the Champlain Housing Trust. It's one of the buildings that is up near the top. The buildings near the bottom of the photo that are gonna have the lake views, those are gonna be high-end and market rate. But there are also gonna be units that are dedicated for the homeless, and we have an application coming in now from the Cathedral Square Corporation for 60 units of senior housing that would also be on this site. This one is also complete and done. This was the second project by Housing Trust Funds to be done. It's back towards the southern part of the state in Putney. So 18 mixed income apartments, all brand new. It's all new construction, and they were filled immediately. I don't know if any of you have been to a ribbon cutting or celebration when a project's completed, but usually they have one or two of the apartments that are open, so you can go in and check them out and see what they look like. No way. Here, the waiting list was so long for these that the people who wanted to say, we're not holding these, we're not keeping people out of their houses just so somebody can come and look. So it was filled immediately. And some of them, this is a neat thing about the Housing Trust Fund is it allows you to mix incomes. I mean, the best practice is to try to have people of all different incomes living together. It creates more opportunity. And so their residents here work, you can see their different places of employment, and there are 16 children that live here. Let me go through a little more quickly. This one's in Randolph. This is a historic home. It's going to be 4 units for people who are chronically homeless that have mental health challenges, and they'll be getting services as well. This one's going to primarily serve families. You can see the playground. Will come with family supportive services, and this was highly energy efficient and has a heating system. You can see the silos, biomass and wood pellet. So actually today, in 2 hours, around 1 o'clock, the city of Rutland is going to celebrate this new neighborhood. It was formerly a blighted public housing authority property that just was not getting the resources it needed to be able to do the appropriate units. Over the course of 10 years in 3 phases, it's been completely redeveloped into a 78 unit new neighborhood. And the Housing Trust Fund, the first 2 phases happened, but they really exhausted the state resources that were available. The Housing Trust Fund and the timing of that, it came along and really helped the 3rd phase happen. So we're excited about this one too. And so there'll be people gathering in Rutland today to celebrate it. So we hope that this seems successful to you. The Housing Trust Fund, I mean, it's been a long time since a new housing program was created. And we've been able to get it out around our state. And these are some of the reasons we think that's worked well. And part of it is the demand is so great. So we always have a long list of projects that are waiting for funding. So the Housing Trust Fund finally became available. There were projects ready to go that had gaps. And we were able to fill those and help create the units that were affordable to the very low income folks. We rely on a network of regionally based housing nonprofits in Vermont. And so they're always plugged into their communities, can bring projects up to us. Our ability to sustain them and for them to continue also really relies heavily on the home program. I'd like to make that point. With a home program, you can provide organizational support, and that's part of what keeps this network working so that we can continue to serve all parts of the state. Some of you may have worked on the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act a few years ago. At that time, it created the ability to project-base more rental assistance, so to target it to specific units. That blended with the Housing Trust Fund really made those 30% units work. I'll just leave it at that. It's a little more complicated. And we were able to work with the housing authorities around the state in order to do that. They were terrific. I already mentioned the flexibility that comes with HTF. The other thing that really has helped us over this little bit since the Housing Trust Fund became available is that the state's doing its share too. We've got some bipartisan agreement in Vermont around the importance of housing. Maybe it has to do with those poll numbers I mentioned earlier, but the state, our Republican governor and Democratic legislature came together and supported a housing revenue bond a couple of years ago that's created the ability to get more projects going. The Housing Trust Fund matches with that. And then the state of Vermont had recently done an extensive planning process around how to end homelessness and done trainings with people. So people were poised, ready to do permanent supportive housing, and they had some of those skills and project ideas ready. So again, when the Housing Trust Fund money became available, we could plug it in. So that's it. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you. And please welcome our last speaker, Chancellor Ellis.
going to go quickly so that we leave enough time for questions. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and where I work. I'm Shauna Sorrells. I'm with the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, Maryland, so right here in this area, which I think will give you a great sort of understanding of the potential for how you might be able to use housing trust fund dollars here within this area, housing that you understand, right? Because it's where you all search for your own housing options. Here in Montgomery, in Maryland, the state of Maryland got $3 million last year. HOC has never used housing trust fund dollars, partially because of the scale, right? In this area, it cost us about $234,000 to build 1 unit of housing. So we tend to look for scale when we do development. At HOC, we are both a housing authority, which you've heard some of the other speakers work with, as well as a housing finance agency. So we're in the business of, we issue our own bonds. We also do home ownership for first-time homeowners of moderate needs. And we obviously do deeply affordable rental housing here in the area. Over the last 5 years, we've spent about $335 million investing in our old public housing as well as other affordable housing units that we had. We have another, our current pipeline is another investment of about $337 million. And what I'm happy to do is share slides after the fact, but I didn't want, we tend to do very dense slides, which aren't very hopeful in the moment, but I'm happy to share that information with you afterwards so you can see some of the developments that I'm going to be talking about. In terms of the community that we serve, when you hear affordable housing needs at 30% of AMI, recognize that in Montgomery County, the area median income is $107,000, right? So even when we're touching the 30% AMI households, some of those are fully employed households, right? And the Housing Trust Fund is also one of the communities that they want to target are areas of opportunity. Montgomery County is, if you have been at all familiar with some of the recent work, the name is escaping me right now. I know you know. Yes, absolutely. So Silver Spring actually was identified as one of the top 10 communities in the country for children to experience economic mobility within their lifetime, right? That's exactly where I work. So our ability to give people housing or to create affordable housing in a community where the gap, just in Montgomery County alone, which is a 500 square mile radius, is 138,000 units, is the gap between what we need for affordable, deeply affordable units. At HOC, while we have close to 8,000 hard units, we have another 8,000 vouchers. Anytime you project-based a voucher on top, while it makes the unit deeply affordable, having other revenue streams actually allows you to expand your housing supply. So we are in the business of expansion, preservation, and obviously serving families that we can with our current resources. Also, as a housing authority, what most housing authorities do is they provide social service and investment, sort of social investment programs, whether it's the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which is a HUD program. We also have a Fatherhood Initiative grant, which is provided by Health and Human Services. We do workforce development with any of our partners. So we not only provide the housing, but we try to provide a pathway to increase self-sufficiency as a housing authority. I will move more quickly to some of the examples of what we do. Actually, but before I do that, I'll talk quickly about the number of people on our current waiting list. Just in Montgomery County, we have about 13,000 people on the wait list today. It is an active wait list. You can log on at any time and fill it in. So this is a fresh data source. Everyone on that list has to update their information within a year. Otherwise, we purge it and move to the next person so that we don't have any delay in trying to serve people. Most communities around the country actually have wait lists that have been closed for multiple years. So we like to keep that number fresh because it tells us exactly what the need is. Of those 31,000 people, about 69,000 are below 30% of AMI. Another 8,400 have listed a household member as disabled. Another 6,400 are elderly, right? Those numbers are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it gives you a sense of the need. 994, I think, somewhere in that range, are actually veteran households in them. Most of them obviously have a need for more than 2 bedrooms, so there are a lot of families on that list. In terms of some of the examples of projects that we've done, we recently had a groundbreaking about 2 weeks ago on Thursday in Chevy Chase Lakes. Chevy Chase, Maryland is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the country to reside. We took what was an old affordable housing development that had 68 townhome garden-style apartments. We sold off a portion of that to a private developer because everybody wants to develop in Montgomery County, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people. And we sold off a portion of that, so we took those 68 units, leveraged the value, the equity from that land, and we built a new 200-unit property. That 200-unit property has 40% affordable units in it, ranging from workforce, 80%. And if you guys aren't on our wait list and you live in Montgomery County area, I would encourage you to apply because it's beautiful. Right, and it's actually within the household, it's in the income range of people like you, right, who are making somewhere between 60 and 80,000. That's actually affordable housing for you, right? So it has 80 affordable housing units. 40% of the entire property is affordable, from 80% down to 40%. But to get to 30%, you need additional equity, and that's where the Housing Trust Fund would have been useful in that project. Had we had that, we would have new units for deeply affordable to 30% or below, right on the line of the new purple line, right? So it would have been transportation rich, within one of the best school districts in the country, right? And here within our own backyard. That's what we would have been able to do had the Housing Trust Fund been larger. And so what we try to do is we try to leverage every other resource available because we know that the need is great, not only across the state, but also within Montgomery County. So that's one of the examples of the way we do affordable housing development here in the county. Now that had no federal money in it, right? We used foundation. And so housing authorities have had to become as creative as possible, leveraging resources because, as has been mentioned, there have not been new housing programs created, and what had been the historical sort of way to provide affordable housing before the housing choice voucher, public housing, right? Nearly all of that stock needs deep investment, and HUD simply doesn't have the resources to provide it. Yes. So that was Chevy Chase Lakes. We have another property called Elizabeth Square. Elizabeth Square actually leverages one of HUD's programs called the Rental Assistance Demonstration. That allows you to recapitalize your public housing, take it out of that funding stream and put it onto a Section 8 platform, which has been more stable at no additional cost. But what we did was we took the opportunity to deconcentrate poverty. So Elizabeth Square is located in Silver Spring. It will have 3 newly constructed buildings in it. One will be elderly, the other 2 will be family. It is entirely mixed income. It is directly proximate to the Red Line, and it will also allow us to have co-located services for the county. We are building within the structure a regional aquatic center that will be competition level. Right, and so it provides an opportunity for everyone within the community to socialize, right, to come together, as opposed to creating isolated pockets of services. And because we were in the process of new construction and development, the county is getting a brand new facility, right, embedded into the project, and we share the cost. The county will operate the service center, which will have full health services, right, classes, yoga, everything else, because we were able to do this together. Had we been able to have Housing Trust Fund dollars available to us, right, we could have done more deeply affordable housing. As it is, we will be project basing rental assistance RAD units, previous public housing within this new construction to the tune of about 140 units. We could have gone bigger had we had more resources, but we tried to maximize every resource available. I'm happy to save time for questions.
Thank all of our speakers for being with us today and showing so many examples of how Housing Trust Fund dollars have been used and what could be done more if the program was funded at the level that's necessary. I want to open up to questions in case folks want to ask questions of our panelists.
Sue Watlow Phillips, Vice President of the National Coalition for the Homeless, and just want to mention to Jen, it was wonderful to have then Representative Sanders in 2001 to introduce the original Housing Trust Fund bill worked on by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the National Coalition for the Homeless. I want to do a shout out to Mary, who is from Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota, and the incredible work that Minnesota has always done around housing, and we passed our state housing trust fund in 1988. And so it's been a wonderful matching, and Mary does an incredible job in bringing as you saw in the mental health area, as well as housing, and really providing housing opportunities for all folks. And so it's just wonderful to see this. I hope that we can significantly increase the Housing Trust Fund, and thanks for all the great work the National Low-Income Housing Coalition is doing around this too.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Jen. My name's Amelia. I'm in Senator Leahy's office. I was wondering if the project in Burlington that's supposed to be mixed income is utilizing any housing trust fund dollars for those units, and if they would be reserved in perpetuity.
Yes, yes, there are housing trust fund dollars there, they're in. Oh. So Emily from Senator Leahy's office is asking about the project I showed in Burlington, on Lake Champlain. She's asking if there are housing trust fund dollars there, and the answer is yes. There's 76 apartments that are under construction right now, and housing trust fund funding is part of that. There will be units dedicated to the homeless, and a number of those will be maintained at 30%. And VHCB has required a perpetual affordability covenant on that as well.
Okay, thanks. I actually meant the downtown project. The
Oh, I'm sorry, you mean the Burlington Town Center that's going up on Church Street? At this point, the developer has to create a certain number of affordable units because of Burlington's inclusionary zoning requirements. But at this point, he's saying he's going to finance that internally within his project, and he hasn't sought public sources for those affordable units yet. Been interested to see if and how he actually does that. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions? Just to remind folks, there are a couple of proposals out there to expand the Housing Trust Fund. The last time that Congress looked at, the Senate looked at housing finance reform, the Johnson-Crapo bill would have funded the Housing Trust Fund at $3.5 billion annually or so. There's been a bill introduced by Senator Warren's office, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, that would fund it more along the scale of $450 billion over 10 years. That's actually what the funding level would be needed to get at this gap that everyone's focused on. The resources that we need are really significant, and we're happy to see major legislation move forward that would put the resources where it's needed. I saw questions. Yes, sir?
You kind of answered it, but can you talk a little bit more about the amount of funding needed to significantly get at the problem and sort of how funding levels translate into units and solving the need?
Absolutely. So we mentioned before that there's a 7.1 million unit shortage of housing for extremely low income households. So the need is immense, and we're looking at every opportunity to move that forward. I think something like Senator Warren's book gives you an example of the scope of the resources that would be needed to actually tackle the resources to get at that shortage. One thing I'll mention though is we hear a lot about the affordable housing crisis impacting people throughout the income chain, further up the income scale as well. One of the major reasons for why middle income households are feeling a pinch is because there's such a shortage at the very lowest end. As long as there's that shortage that's growing, those folks have nowhere else to live but in housing that would otherwise be affordable to middle income people. And so the more deeply targeted resources we have, the more deeply targeted units we build, the more we can make up for that market correction and have units that are fulfilling the needs of everybody throughout the income spectrum as well.
Can I add something to that? So it can be kind of daunting when you think about the number of units needed and you're thinking, gosh, how are we ever gonna get enough funding to be able to do all that? But there are two things to remember about that. One is that every single unit that's created helps not just one household, but many, many, many over time. And then the other thing is that when you can bring a number of units into a community, it not only helps those specific households, you create that number of units, but it also helps create more, it affects the whole market. It makes the less demand on other units, and it just helps those vacancy rates increase a little bit so that the market is less tight and people have less housing instability, they've got more housing options. So the benefits ripple out, it goes far beyond just the particular home that gets created with the trust fund dollars.
And actually, there's been a Moody Analytics report of what a building, $450 billion of housing trust fund units over 10 years through the Warren bill, what that would do for across the market. And it would actually decrease rents by 10% across the board. So you can see that increasing the supply is very important, but making sure that when that supply is built, that it has to be built at the very lowest end in order to have that ripple effect.
Just one more question to follow. To the extent that there's, and not to sort of make it either or, but if there could be more funding to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund versus more funding to low-income housing tax credits, is the Affordable Housing Trust Fund just a little bit easier to use because it's just direct dollars and grants, or not necessarily?
So they're different programs, and we definitely support an expansion and improvement to the low-income housing tax credit through the Campbell Hatch bill. That would increase the low-income housing tax credit by about 50%, but it also includes reforms that make it easier to serve people with extremely low incomes. We have always supported the Housing Trust Fund as our number one priority above the low-income housing tax credit because it's more deeply targeted to where the needs are. And it's a grant program, so it goes more directly. But that's not to say that we aren't supportive of the Campbell Hatch bill as well.
I would say it's very much a both and. You really do need that sort of major momentum that's created by the low-income housing tax credit. It's a source of financing. It's a source of drawing in private capital that is there year after year. And because of the way both programs are structured, the ability to combine them is very, very high. You heard from Jennifer, from Shauna, from myself, these mixed income developments are really the types of developments that most communities prefer. And they really, for a lot of families, do tend to work the best. And so, and I think you really leverage the power of the National Housing Trust Fund by having it work in combination with the tax credit program.
I would add to that the way the low-income housing developers end up using the low-income housing tax credit, it's all about filling in the gap, right? Which is one of the ways they would also use the housing trust fund. So if you remove one of those, you simply increase the gap, right? And so you're going to need more in either one of those to replace it. I would also add that while one of the things that is nice about the Housing Trust Fund is the ability to target, and we have heard some of the programs or some of the development examples that allow supportive services on sites, I would suggest that here in Montgomery County, that's probably one of the ways that we would use it, is to create smaller developments. But again, the cost of construction, the cost of development here in the area, and even acquisition, right, means that it's extremely expensive to do it.